Welcome to Chess Dude. Today we are going to dive into one of the powerful chess openings for black against one e4, which is nimzowitch defense. By the end of this video, you will be equipped with the knowledge to confidently play this opening and set yourself up for a victory. So let's get started. So the nimzowitch defense starts with e4 knight c6. This opening is favored for players at all levels because it often leads to strong positions for black. In this video, we are going to focus into the lines after 2d4. If white plays knight f3 instead, we would go e5 and shift into the king's pawn opening. But we'll cover that in a separate video. So after e4, knight c6, d4, we are going to hit back with d5, aiming to challenge the center. At this point, white has four main responses: e into d5, e5, knight c3, and bishop b5. Let's start by looking at e into d5. Where we'll capture the pawn with our queen. White might play knight f3 and we respond with e5 to pressure the d4 pawn and hope for a queen exchange. From here, white has three options: d into e5, knight c3 and c4. Let's first tackle knight c3. Where they are attacking our queen, instead of moving our queen away, we'll pin the knight with bishop b4, keeping the pressure up. If white plays bishop d2 to get rid of the pin, our queen's under attack, so we'll just capture the knight with our bishop. White will recapture with their bishop. And then we'll play e4 to attack their knight. White defends with knight e5 and will exchange the knights. Now, don't take their queen on d1. Exchanging queens opens up the file for white rook, which isn't great for us. Instead, play knight e7 to protect our queen. If white takes our queen, we'll recapture with our knight. If they play bishop c4, we'll take their bishop on c3, doubling up their pawns, and then play bishop f5 to get a slight edge. Moving forward, we can castle, play c6, h5 and rook d8. Now let's get back and see what if white plays bishop e2 instead of exchanging queens. So here, we castle and they do 2. Then we'll put our rook on e8 and we got a stable position. From here, we can play bishop f5 and a6 and maybe move our queen to e6 or c6, keeping things solid. Now let's see what happens if white plays 5c4 attacking our queen. We'll play queen e4 with check, and if white responds with bishop e3, we capture with e into d4. After a series of exchanges, we reach a position where we can play bishop f5, getting ready to castle. If they play knight c3, we castle and so do they. Notice how strong the bishop on d4 is. So we'll play knight e7 to prep for knight c6 and chase the bishop off. White will probably play bishop e2 to connect their rooks, and we go knight c6, maintaining a good stable setup. We can follow up with bishop e6 and rook e8 and we are in a good position. Finally, if white goes 5d into e5, we will exchange queens. Here, we can't play knight e7 immediately because after queen into d5, knight into d5, bishop c4, we don't have the knight capture on c3 like in the last variation. So after king into d1, we will play bishop g4 to prep for knight into e5. White will likely protect with bishop f4, so we'll play bishop c5 to target their f2 pawn, which they will protect with king e1. We will then play knight e7 to prepare knight g6, aiming to double attack their bishop and pawn. White might play knight bd2 and we respond with knight g6, delivering double attack. After bishop g3, we will castle queen side and this position feels super comfortable for black. We can then play rook h e8, knight d4, eventually snagging that pawn on e5. Now let's check out what happens if white goes for 3 e5. In this position, we will play bishop f5, developing our bishop. White might respond with c3 and we'll follow up with e6. White has two main moves here, bishop d3 and knight f3. First, Let's look at knight f3. We'll go with f6. If white plays bishop b5, we respond with knight e7. After e into f6, we'll capture with g into f6. If white plays knight h4, we'll play bishop g6. Next, we'll go for queen d7, knight f5, longside castle and bishop d6, giving us a comfortable position. If white castles instead of playing knight h4, we'll simply go a6, and if they capture on c6, we'll recapture with our knight. Now let's see what happens if white plays 5 bishop d3. We'll play knight ge7 to avoid double pawns. If white plays knight e2, we respond with f6, and after e into f6, we capture back with g into f6. Here, after knight f4, bishop into d3 is crucial because white has the idea of capturing with the bishop followed by knight e6. So, after queen into d3, we will push e5. If white attacks the f6 pawn with knight h5, we play queen d6 to protect it. White might try pushing b4 and we'll capture with e into d4. After a few moves like bishop f4, queen e6 check, queen e2, queen into e2 check, king into e2, d into c3, and knight into c3, and longside castle, we end up with a pawn up and in a great position. Now let's see what happens if white goes for knight c3 on their third move. We are going to play d into e4. Don't worry about the d5 push because we have knight e5 to handle it. Here, white has two popular options, queen d4 and knight into e5. Let's dive into queen d4 first. We will play knight g6, and if white captures on e4 with their knight, we respond with e6, leading to a solid position for us. Further, we can play bishop d7, bishop c6, bishop d6, knight e7, knight f5, f6, castles, and rook d8. Black is super comfortable in this setup. So, if white captures with the queen instead, we will play knight f6 attacking their queen. When the queen goes to a4 with the check, we will block it with bishop d7. If white plays bishop b5, we push a6, and after bishop into d7 check, queen into d7, queen into d7 check, knight into d7, we are all set. We will castle queenside and play h6 to avoid any bishop g5 or knight g5 threats, and we should be in a good shape. Now let's tackle knight into e4. We'll go with e6. If white captures d into e6, we'll exchange queens and play bishop into e6, leaving us in a great position. We can follow up with longside castle, knight f6, knight into e4, and knight g4. If instead of d into e6, white plays c4, we'll go knight f6. If they play bishop g5, we simply capture with e into d5, and after c into d5, we play bishop b4 check. Following that with knight c3, short castle, queen b3, and bishop into c3 check, we end up in a fantastic position. The d5 pawn is weak, and we can play rook e8 to take advantage of the open file. Now let's see what happens if white plays bishop b5 on the third move. We'll go with d into e4. At this point, white has two main moves, d5 and knight c3. First, let's dive into knight c3. We get rid of the pin with bishop d7. If they go for d5, we will simply play knight e5. White exchanges the bishops, and then white will likely go queen d4. We respond with knight g6, and we are back to the position we discussed earlier. The only difference is that the queen is on d7 instead of in d8. That shouldn't be a problem, so you can play the same moves discussed in that variation. Let's head back and see what if white plays knight into e4. We'll capture the pawn on d4 with our knight. If white takes with the queen, we'll capture the bishop. If white plays bishop into d7, we take back with our queen. Here, we are in a great position with the pawn up. Now let's see what happens if white plays d5 on the fourth move. Our knight is under attack and we can't move it because of the pin. So we counterattack with a6. White has few choices here. If they go for d into c6, we'll exchange queens first. This means white can't castle since their king has moved. We will then take the hanging bishop on b5 with our pawn. When white plays c into b7, we will capture back with bishop into b7. This position is completely winning for us. Our bishop is active and we can castle next, then play e6 and knight f6, leaving white's king weak. Overall, it's a very comfortable position for black. Now let's see what happens if white plays bishop into c6. We'll capture back with b into c6, then after d into c6, queen into d1 check, and king into d1, we'll play e5 to prevent bishop f4. If white plays knight c3, attacking our pawn on e4, we defend it with bishop f5. Further, moves like bishop g6, f5 and knight e7 will put us in a great position. Now let's see what happens if white retreats the bishop to a4. We'll go with b5 attacking the bishop. White might respond with d into c6, we'll play queen into d1 check, king into d1. At this point things are already looking better for black. We will play b into a4, and if white plays bishop f4, unlike in the last variation where we had time to play e5 to prevent bishop f4, this time it seems like our pawn on c7 might fall. But we can go bishop g4 check, knight e2, long castle with a check, defending our pawn, and with king e1 and f6, this position looks really good for black. Next, we can play e5, knight e7, followed by knight into c6 and a3. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching. I hope this tutorial has given you a solid foundation in the nimzowitch defense opening. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Keep practicing and enjoy your games.